Great. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you so much for the invitation. As a performer and philosopher, I find archives really exciting, and I'm going to talk today a little bit about how I think about archives, what I've learned from working on anti-imperial archives, and I will show a project I was really delighted to be part of. And I we'll talk through a few elements of that project. It's a website. The URL will be shared with you in the day. And then I'll draw some conclusion for it. And I hope to do that in 15 minutes. And it's probably going to work. So often going into the archives means finding that those that came before us were ahead of us. And that can be quite a humbling experience. At least for me, it has been many, many times that I thought I was really savvy in certain discussions. And then I go back to people that have been working on stuff. And I find perspectives or interventions or propositions that I found thoroughly unexpected. And that's very exciting because that means we keep learning from our peers and across contexts. And that is what this mini talk will be about. So archives, however, do not show a kind of simple new content or an old perspective that has been perhaps erased, right? Sometimes it was part of a liberation struggle to stay out of the archive, because if you were archived, it means you were actually captured by hegemony. So there's many different tensions, and it is not kind of sort of undiluted or straight up. And especially with the performing arts, sometimes there's also work done to let performances flow away, because performances, they change discussions or perspectives or collectives, and they can come across as very sort of localized. And so performances as such, they do a certain work, or they show a certain care for something, but they're not necessarily objects that are frozen in time and then hold a certain truth stable in that. As I said, so performances, they can come with propositions, interventions, or show certain networks. And while hegemonic theater always carries the claim that it supports democracy, right? That's very important. A very important part of hegemonic theater. But what would anti-imperial theater do? Because what do performances do that speak about the duress that democracy levels at those that are oppressed? Not support democracy. So something else is going on there. Do they then speak truth to power? Maybe, but maybe not, because power might not be listening, or anti-imperial theater makers might just have other concerns to deal with. And so I want to take you now along with me to the Revolutionary Papers Project. This was a research project where a discussion was set up between different researchers of anti-imperial journals to show what kind of work journals do. And I think as theater makers, I hope you, but certainly I did as a theater maker or a performer, learned a lot from looking at journals and seeing what I can learn from, hopefully, from performances. And so I'm going to take you through a few journals, and to show that journals do not just sort of give info as if text is always informational, but work and do a few more things besides. So the first journal I want to look at is Al-Jadid. Al-Jadid means the new. And by looking at the table of contents of one of the issues, we can see that it's actually concerned with a few things. So to give you a perspective, Al-Jadid is a a communist and anti-Zionist journal it was produced close after the Nakba in 1948 in Palestine, Israel. And it was a collaboration under the Communist Party between Palestinians and Jewish communists. And they were working together to partly re-establish a literary world of Arabic-speaking literature, because with the loss of the cities in Palestine, Palestinian literature lost its infrastructure in which it could come to blossom. And so this journal, Al Jadid, you see that there's a few poems in there and stories, where the journal itself was the replacement of the communal center or the literary center or the university, where literature could come to bloom. But what we also see is an internationalist network. You see that Emil Tuma writes under the name Ibn Khaldun about the struggle in Guatemala, to link out to work that was done on a communist flag in Latin America. But we also have a discussion about Martin Andersen Nexo, a Danish socialist. I was totally unfamiliar with the man, I must admit, where you see that internationalist networks are not simple, but layered and nuanced. And what it was concerned with, journal as a whole, is building a kind of an anti-colonial cultural scene, both within Israel, Palestine, but also outside of it. Let's go to the second journal. I hope this is one. Yeah. So Idris Jabari wrote about Alamil al-Tunsi, or Perspective Tunisiens, which is a journal that came out in Tunisia during the uprisings there. And when you look at this journal, what you see quite often is that the design comes to a certain peak, and then it looks quite good, and with maybe a certain, what we can think of, an anti-colonial aesthetic, and then it sort of becomes quite shabby looking again, and a bit like not so slick, and then grows to a much more what we now might call professional looking design, or a more nuanced design, or a more thought through anti-colonial aesthetic. And what happens, what Idris explains, is that quite often the editors would either flee the country, be arrested, or in this case, that the students that were running this journal were drafted into the army as a way to oppress the socialist student movement and the anti-colonial student movement. So you see that the journal has a certain aesthetic life and a certain shifts in aesthetic style, because the editors were constantly under pressure, and there the university was still the site of struggle, which is not necessarily the case now. Universities like Stefano Harney and Fred Moten, they often talk about universities as little factories. And we can see that a certain factorization of the university might work against certain forms of struggle, or you might find that precarity might work against certain forms of struggle. So what we can learn from the discussion in Perspectives Tunisiens and the shape that the journal takes is how certain external pressures work upon the method, as well as the discussion, as well as the location in which the discussion takes place. So from here, I would like to go to Balochistan. Yeah. And in Balochistan, the journal Al-Jabar was produced. Mavish Ahmed writes about that. And the journal was directed not so much at the people of Balochistan at all. It was actually directed to middle-class Pakistani elite to support the struggle. And beyond that, it was also reaching out in the internationalist network to support the struggle of the freedom of Balochistan, which is still going to this day, right? And instead of saying, like, here we see a part of this journal, like, to support that freedom struggle, it is proposed like that we don't want tanks, we don't want aeroplanes, we don't want massive, gigantic guns. What we need are small, almost imperceptible things. We do want help from friends, small help for a big cause, for a noble cause. And what you see is that solidarity is sometimes wants to hide. It wants to go under the radar because the radar is owned by hegemony. And so it is not necessarily, if something doesn't show up in an archive, that it is erased. Sometimes there is a lot of work to actually stay out of that. But the solidarity that is always action in the present can still take place. And this work in Al-Jabbar in Balochistan is very, very clear about that. And so the not to be forgotten is a perspective in the present, right? Time is pressing, so I quickly move on to the last journal I want to discuss, and that is the Namibian Review, which is Connie Benson worked on that in Cape Town. Nashilangu Musanja works on that, and Asher Gametse. And Asher Gametse, he was a Trotskyist revolutionary in the ANC. Then when the ANC like sort of took over and became neoliberal, Asher became a cultural worker. He is also a fantastic jazz musician. He made a record in 2018 called Dialectic Soul, which shows that Trotsky is thought still. And the New York Times voted it the best jazz record of 2018. It's really, find it on your music streaming service. It is really exciting. And what we see here in a discussion in 1976, there's a discussion between the equation of Black power and white extremism. And is that the same thing? And the discussion here says, well, on the one hand, we have this horseshoe theory, right? Oh, all the extremes are the same, which they shove aside, saying like race and class often gets conflated by a certain kind of lefties. So we need to take them apart and see the specific pressures so that the work that we now know as quote unquote intersectionality comes with a very, very long lineage. And intersectionality, the term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, is a very specific term that comes out of a legal discussion, while the discussion itself comes with all kinds of nuances. And so that is their first argument, like race and class should not be conflated, but kept apart. And then they look at Black power, and in a quite surprising statement is that they say that Black power, on the one hand, speaks back against white racism, but Black power is actually, and let me says like Black power serves to many reasonable and just upholding white Americans were giving a new push in their effort to defend the rights and human dignity of Black citizens. So that is a specific view on Black power that, for me at least, was quite new. Black power as a form of claim to citizenship and as a demand on a certain form of solidarity. And so to conclude the lecture, because we're almost near the end, when you come into the archives and you find these conversations that are sometimes networks, as we saw in Al Jadid, sometimes aesthetic tools, as we saw in Perspectives Tunisiennes, sometimes new concepts, small help from friends, or interventions in discussions like Black power is to create a stronger form of white solidarity, you find that they contain for you also an invitation to become translators across contexts, whether these contexts are across time, this happened in the 70s or the 60s or the 40s, positionality, Black and white, a Danish socialist amidst the Palestinian struggle, or situations, Balochistan versus Lahore, for instance. And that work of translation that you are invited to do as reader of a journal, as viewer of a performance, as researcher into the archive, is a practice of solidarity. And so for today, I actually wish for you a space of solidarity. And that space of solidarity is always necessary amidst the violence that continues to this day. Thank you. Are there any questions?
I hope you heard the applause, Mijke.
No, I was just
it was
hearing
an
like
amazing applause. Everybody applauded.
okay.
Are there any questions? They're still thinking about questions, and I'll save them with my question in the meantime. So I love what you said about spaces of solidarity and a practice of solidarity, how heritage practices can also be practices of solidarity. But how do you handle these documents of struggle with care? Like, how do you keep their kind of their integrity intact while making it accessible, though, because you're still functioning in a system?
Yeah, thanks. That is a totally profound question, of course. I think one of the things that in the project happened a lot is that researchers, my contemporaries, were actually just sitting down with people that were part of certain struggles. And so in the case of Connie Benson and Nashilanguship and Musanja, they just, who are my contemporaries, literally sit down with Asher, who is a generation older than us, and just talk. What happened? Why did you see it like this? What was going on? And that when you come with a certain perspective, and a perspective is not just a truth you hold because of how you live, and it is not individual, because sometimes you're just saturated in a world, and that world, how you navigate it, gives you a certain practical truth and a certain theoretical perspective, and these are not necessarily the same. But sometimes when you then engage something, even though we have to sometimes, especially if you're marginalized in one way or another, had to fight quite hard to reach a certain truth, you actually also have to be prepared in that meeting across context, across positionalities, or through time, to give up what you know, to give up what you bring along, in order to have a situation, a context, a perspective speak to you without you already intervening in what you can hear. And that is the difference between solidarity work and hegemonic work, because hegemonic work will never give up its truth, right? It holds the structure stable even when it quote unquote diversifies. And anti-imperialist work starts always by the readiness to give up what you know in order to receive what somebody else has experienced. So let's put it there.
Great answer, I think. That's very, very well. Is there anyone else who has a question? Oh, yeah, I have, or you can stand here, and or I can like copy, but Mike won't hear you from there. So yes, okay, I'll copy.
So as I understand the lecture, you were talking about ways of approaching or understanding an archive by delve into its content, and how you can use that to colonize. But I'm also wondering how you think about the decolonization of the principles of the archive. And so by that I mean, how does an archive come into existence, and how do you continue it? And this
will be very long for me to copy. Maybe just because I think you put it very well. Like, I think it's easier. Here you can see 3 versions of Mike.
Hi.
Hi.
So yeah, I have a question. So could you hear what I already said?
Only snippets. So if you would repeat it, I would be very grateful.
I will. So you just gave a lecture explaining the archive, and also in contrast to a museum. So it's not only just a collection, but it's a necessary one. And I'm wondering, so now we looked at 3 different approaches of how to decolonize an archive by going into its content. But so what would you say about decolonizing the institutionalized frame of the archive.
Yep, nail on the head. Yeah, I think fighting, from my perspective, I would say fighting the institution is partly what the anti-hegemonic struggle is, right? Because if we look at the work, for instance, of Aníbal Quijano, he's quite clear where he says, like, hegemony or imperialism or European imperialism is having every aspect of life ruled by a system of interlocking institutions, whether that are educational institutions, the family, the factory, the corporation, law, or indeed museums and archives. So since it is an interlocking system of different institutions, right? Like, who can you marry? When can you marry? When is it legal? Where we see like religion intersecting with social life, how that is organized with law, with often structures of inheritance or non-inheritance. The fighting the institution is never a simple thing, and it is never done. So I think when I learned from Moten and Harney, for instance, what I see is that the institution is always something that needs to be navigated. And that we can do that navigation in various ways. I think as a union organizer, I would see sometimes that navigation is quite direct. We stand up against precarity because we deserve proper contracts. And yet when we get proper contracts, we have to watch out not to be assimilated into the institution and become diligent workers sometimes, right? We have to keep the anti-imperial struggle alive. And yet navigating a system of an institution that is an archive or a school or a museum requires often sort of like bring a mini crowbar along and pry in the gaps and be mindful of, as you undoubtedly already know, like be mindful when you run into a single truth or when you manage to open the space and find the plurality of different worlds that build together a pluriversal politics. And I think to hold that struggle open between keeping a single truth of an hegemonic institution at bay into a pluriversal set of worlds that is held sometimes together by an organization, and whether that organization is, for instance, in the case of Al-Jadid, the Communist Party of Israel, or in the case of Baluchistan, an underground fighting organization, that's a bit open. But not every organization is an institution, and we have seen bad examples, the ANC becoming from a revolutionary organization, becoming an institution, to better examples where institutions have managed to say, oh, we're going to step out of the single truth. And so the onus is not on you. The onus is on the institution to give up a single form of organizing and break open the pluriverse of which we are already part.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think with looking at the time, this is it for now. Thank you so much, Mijke. I'll make sure to take my mini crowbar along for the day. Yeah, thanks again.
Thank you. And have a good day. It's a pity I cannot be there. I'm in London. I would have loved to take part, but I wish you a fantastic day and have a good one. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.